Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and my guest today is David Gorman, who's an Alexander Technique teacher in Toronto, Canada. He's been a teacher for many, many years, and he has developed his own approach to some of Alexander's ideas and added some of his own, which is called Learning Methods. You can find out more about it from the link next to this podcast. And we've just completed a sort of first exercise of the kind that he would normally do on his workshops that involves noticing the effects of changing, making some subtle changes in how your weight is distributed over your feet when standing. And we're now going to do what would normally follow upon that in his workshops. David, why don't you introduce it and we'll go through it with us.
Okay, thanks, Robert. I won't do the whole introduction. I did for the first part because you really do want to go back and do that first part before you do this part. It is a definitely step-by-step sequence that builds upon what we've done before. But I will recap just for a very brief second. We started off just finding that we have this sensitivity to be aware of how we're in contact with the ground. And this is often called the contact sense and is one of the main balance mechanism senses, along with the eyes and the inner ears and the otolith organs and the neck reflexes and so on. So we played with that a little bit in terms of finding that there was a kind of even distribution of contact, the significance of which is it's your more or less your center of support. And as soon as you go out of that, that is, you go more to the front or more to the back, we found that things have to jump into action, tightenings here, tightenings there, little distortions, reaches for balance, etc., that protect your balance. And that this happens automatically and is also conscious. And interestingly, of course, enough, when you go, let's say, more forward, you get different things happening within you on opposite sides of you than when you go backwards. So not only are we exquisitely sensitive when we're open to it and paying attention to our actual contact with the ground, as you move around, you get lots of other sensations and feelings that can show you not only what's going on within you and how parts of you are responding, but even what sort of imbalance in what direction once you learn how to interpret it, once you get in touch with it. So we were playing with that just in terms of simple standing being more or less upright. And I'd like to extend that a little bit now. So if you, again, everybody stand up who's listening to this, stand up and come to that even distribution of contact, that more or less centered support where those holdings and tightenings do not need to be happening. And this time what I want you to play around with a little bit is just to see, while you more or less stay in that even distribution of contact, what other things can you do other than just standing? And here there's a big advantage of doing this thing in a group, of course, because you get some people exploring something that other people see and they go, I didn't think of that, and they start to play with it too. But
so for me, the obvious thing was starting to move my arms out to the side or front or towards the back.
Yeah, we can extend our arms out in space in various directions. You can also rotate, that is, you don't just face forward, you can turn to the side or turn around, and just notice, especially if you let yourself be free enough to be a bit bendable even in your legs, you can pretty much get all the way around to look behind yourself while more or less staying in that even distribution of contact.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now while staying more or less in that even distribution of contact, for instance, could you touch the floor with a finger? And if so, what has to happen in order to do that?
Well, in my case, what has to happen is that my knees have to bend a bit, but I'm not sure what else happened.
Yeah. So let's kind of go through a little bit of these and just see if you're standing there in that even distribution of contact, and let's just say in terms of that first one about you can move your arms around in various ways. If you bring both your arms up at once in front of you, do you notice anything happen as you bring them up and then bring them down and bring them up and bring them down?
Okay, so I'm feeling what seems to be a little bit of tension in my back, or tightening in my back, possibly
Okay.
in the back of my legs as well,
Okay.
which
Now
would make sense from a balance point of view.
yes, depending on how one goes about it. Now, play around with this a little bit. There's basically two ways one can do that. One is sort of more or less, perhaps implicitly or explicitly saying, I want to stay right where I am now in terms of my uprightness and neither move forward and backwards. Then as the arms come up, of course, you have more mass out in front, and there will have to be some sort of tightenings, or you may, in fact, other people may find themselves with a bit more contact on the front of their feet. But if for a moment you just play around with a little backwards and forwards enough to go, oh, yeah, I've got ankles that are free to move. And notice there's another way to do this where as your arms come up, your entire length from the floor right up to your head can go back a little bit. And as the arms go down, you come forward a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And does that change what's happening within you in terms of what you were saying about the tightening? And
yeah, well, when I let that happen, there's less tightening. So I assume that the balance redistribution is taking place
yeah,
with pretty much the whole body certainly from the ankles up.
yes. And if you play around with this, and you can do it, backwards too, bringing your arms up and go, if I let this happen, especially if I play around with it, and the operative word here is playing, kind of having explorative fun, you'll notice that it gets easier and easier to do until you're not even really having to think about going backward and forward. It just kind of happens. As the arms come up, your system goes a little back. As they come up to the front, your system goes a little back. As they go up to the back, you go a little forwards. And that is kind of an automatic adjustment that will tend to happen unless we have some other habit of holding or idea of how we're going about it that would stop it. And as you said, Robert, it means you end up with the movement, but not as much of the holding or tightening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? Now, I always hesitate in these things to speak about right and wrong because, of course, we can go about and do things any way we like. We're free in that sense. We have the freedom to do it any way we want. Part of my job in going through these things is, first of all, to help uncover the principles that are involved in how your system works. And secondly, to get people back in touch with how it works so that they're feeling these changes and these differences. Then, of course, you have the option of choosing which of those different ways you would like better. Do you like the one where your arms come up and things tighten a bit? Or do you like the one where there's kind of an automatic, quote-unquote, balance adjustment? And it's not right and wrong, it's your choice, but at least now you have the awareness of the difference, the feeling of the difference, and the ability to make the choice that makes sense to you. And nobody can say what's the right choice, that's up to you. Generally, of course, people tend to choose the one that's more free and easier and gives them more breathing and so on and so forth. But at the very least, you can see it opens up awareness and choice in places that it probably wasn't there before.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But let's go on a little bit here and see again. Generally, when I do this in a group, I'll find there's a number of people who bend in the way that you were describing, Robert, where they find themselves coming and touching the floor with a finger while their knees bend forwards and their bottom goes out backwards and their torso kind of bends forward, and they're staying more or less in that even distribution of contact. There's some people who will do it by kind of reaching out more with just their upper body, sometimes down to their lower back, sometimes right to their hips, and bend with their knees straight.
Mm-hmm.
And some people, especially yoga people or dancers, have the length of tissues to be able to touch the floor with a finger and keep their legs straight and do it in a fairly open and free way, but not most of us. So as we play around a little bit with this, getting people to just see what's the difference, and again, not right and wrong, but what's the difference between if they do it, and you can all play with it at the same time now, if you keep your legs straight and you bend as much as you can from your hip joints rather than your lower back, and do it gently and with ease so you don't hurt yourself, and just see, A, how far can you get if you're not letting your knees be part of it, and what's the general feeling of it in terms of freedom or effort or strain. And then do it the other way where you're letting your knees kind of as if you are on the ground and you're a big spring that can bounce up and down here, the same way you would do it. And throughout these whole series, I find a very powerful kind of teaching tool is just what I call sneaking up on something. And I'll give you an example of it right here. People that have not been as used to bending by kind of letting their legs fold up, but rather have kind of just bent their torso out with their legs more straight, can find it rather challenging to figure out, well, how do I let my knees bend and my hips bend? And so if we sneak up on it by doing something that is more or less the same but kind of different enough, it's often very easy. And I'll go about it this way, say, there you are standing on the ground, just come over onto one foot and simply lift one leg up so that your knee comes up towards your chest while you're more or less centered on the other foot. So in other words, you're kind of lifting your foot straight off the ground, and that's a bending in your ankle, in your knee, and in your hip all at once. So just kind of feel that, then go over onto the other foot and do it with the other leg and get all those joints working at once so your foot is kind of staying flat on, parallel to the floor as it's coming up. And then just do it with both legs at once, but of course you can't lift your both legs off the ground, so do it the other way by going a bit down towards the ground and letting that bending happen. And that's the kind of bending I mean.
Mm-hmm.
So as you're doing that kind of somewhat bending there, do that to touch the floor. And within that minute or two of kind of quote-unquote sneaking up on it, just about everybody can bend and touch the floor by bending in all those three major joints without having to bend in their back. Just kind of like that. And then, of course, you can see how different that is compared to the bending where you didn't let the knees bend. And so we can explore that just a little bit more because, again, it's not so much right and wrong. It's notice if you go and touch the floor or go as far as you can without strain by keeping your knees straight, notice as you get down towards the floor with your knees straight, however far you can, you'll have found yourself with your torso and your head in a certain position. Now, if while you stay in that position, getting towards the floor as much as you can without strain, you try to look up at the world around you, you'll probably find that you can't really get your head more than part way up, and you could sort of maybe see across to about 3 or 4 feet up the wall, but you couldn't see right up to the ceiling without really cranking your head back. So you've been able to get towards touching the ground, but you've kind of limited some of the other movements, and often for people used up most of the flexibility of the back to get there. Now, in contrast, notice if you do that sneaking up on it again just by lifting your leg off the ground and then the other leg off the ground and then both together as you go to touch the ground. When you get down to touch the ground, you can generally look much, much further up without nearly the amount of tightening your head. And of course, you've got a lot more flexibility in terms of how much knees you allow and how much hips, and more knees and less hips, or more hips and less knees. So in other words, once you allow yourself to use 3 big joints, you end up with a quite different poise and freedom and flexibility than if, for whatever reason, you only end up using 2 of the joints. There's another little thing you can see in this in terms of the support thing. If you're in a position where you can get over against a wall and back up to the wall so your heels are against the wall and your bottom's against the wall and your shoulders are against the wall, then staying where you are with your feet, can you bend forward and touch the ground with a finger? Mm-hmm. And of course, you'll find very quickly that you can't, right, because you simply can't get part of you backwards enough to be able to bring your torso forward enough to get down there. So interesting enough, we've got this compensation thing again, which we can explore now with a further further aspect of what you can do from within this one-centered support. And that is, when you first mentioned, Robert, that you can lift your arms up and reach out in various directions to the length of your arm, you know, you could get something out as long as your arm is in front of you, say, or to the side. Can you get something that's about, say, 6 inches or 10 or 12 centimeters further out than that and still stay centered in your support? And if so, how do you do it?
When you say 6 inches further, what direction are you talking here?
Let's say you have your arm out in front of you, and if you could grab something with your hand that's as far away from you as the length of your arm. What if that thing was another 6 inches further out in front of you? Could you get it? Of course, you can get it simply by reaching forward, but you'll find yourself way out on the front of your feet with your toes tightened up and probably your head way pulled back and a lot of tightness happening.
Mm-hmm. Or you might, in my case, I would just bend my knees.
Yeah. You'll find that, in fact, in order to go that much further out in one direction, you simply need to let parts of you go that much further back in the other direction. Mm-hmm. Generally the hips, perhaps a little easier to see if your arm is out to the side. If you want to go another 5 or 6 inches or 10 or 12 centimeters or 15 centimeters to that side, you simply let your whole hips in the middle of you go the other way at the same moment. So while you're listening to this, if you just play around with that and go, the moment I want to go and get something a little further out at the exact same moment, what if I let the sort of middle part of me, without being too specific, just go out the other way? In other words, you're letting these kind of, again, compensations or counterbalances happen. And if you play around with that, you can't see me, but I'm playing with it back and forth, out to one side, out to the front, out to the other side. And again, you start to find after a moment or two of playing with it how natural it kind of feels to let that happen.
And I assume that you're wanting to keep the weight distribution on your feet fairly balanced?
Yes, within all of this, we're really seeing what can I do with this even distribution of contact? Can I bend and touch the ground? Can I move around? Can I rotate? Can I even, what most people would call reaching out? Can I do all of that and still stay centered and hence as free as possible? So notice the difference in this compensation or counterbalance from the one we were doing before in the first podcast, where as I asked you to go further and further back, for instance, people were finding, oh, my arms have to suddenly jump out in front of me to reach for balance, or my entire torso and body kind of arches with my abdomen stuck forward to compensate. Those are reactions and are kind of forced compensations. It's what your system does to protect you, and you'll tend to get tighter and tighter into them. These are quite different. These are ones where you're, in a sense, choosing to allow that compensation so that you can stay centered, so that you remain free while you're doing things. And of course, you can feel the difference if you come to your even distribution of contact again and go way back until you feel that arching of your back and the hands reaching out to protect your balance. You can probably even hear from my voice, my breathing is held, my abdomen is tight, and it's a whole different experience than when, say, I reach around behind me and let my knees and the rest of me bend a bit forward, or I reach out in front of me and let my bottom go back, and there I'm staying just as open and just as free and just as centered. I'm simply using my flexibility, and after a while that can become such a natural way to do it that it more or less happens by itself.
Mm-hmm.
But the interesting thing with this whole territory is it doesn't even matter if it happens by itself or not, because the point of it all is that you're starting to get aware of and sensitized to the things that happen within your system as you move around. So if you, for instance, reached out to the side and did what a lot of people do and just literally reach for it by taking your arm and your upper body out there, you'll very quickly see that you're way over on one foot and your toes are probably tightened and they're strained throughout you, and the further you go, the more your head is having to strain back to protect you, which we'll get to in a second. And that's an entirely different experience, one of strain and effort and reaction, than when you go out to the side and you let that compensation happen at the same time. So it doesn't matter if the other one happens, because you'll notice it. And you'll be able to go, oh, okay, I get it. I even know what it means. I know that I've gone way out of support that direction. And so the change that you could do to operate better is so obvious.
Mm-hmm.
So as you said in the first one, the first of our podcasts, it's not only a getting in touch and not only understanding how we function, but literally getting an ongoing sensory guidance system that you can rely on, that really is going to tell you what's going on and how it works and when you're tight. And it's not just to get the feelings that are good, it's to know what those are feelings of. When I reach out forward or I bend in such a way that I'm out in front of myself, all of those tightenings and strains are tightenings and strains, and I'll know I probably don't like them, but I'll also know what they are. Is there an imbalance forward? In that sense, it's no longer an unconscious habit pattern of my head pulling back. And let's just explore that one for a minute. If you come to the even distribution of contact again, more or less upright, take a moment to drop everything away here and just be standing, looking around in the world and that even distribution of contact. Put your arm up in front of you, out level, as you'd reach out in front of you, but still in the center. And then just go, oh, there's something I want to grab fast. Somebody's got some money out there. And reach out with your arm by sticking your shoulder a bit forward and following it with your torso. And quite quickly, you'll find you're way far forward on your feet with your toes tightening against the floor. But the more you reach, the more you may notice that your head is starting to tighten back. Your neck is bending backwards and your head is starting to tighten back as you reach the limit of how far you can reach. Does that?
Yep, I certainly experienced that.
Notice what that's doing for you, because if you stay out there straining a bit with your head pulling back and you actually let your head come forward and no longer pull back, you'll find it tips you forward off balance. So that head pulling back is not some, as it were, unconscious habit pattern that I'm doing, in the way that we often think about it. It's in fact a balance reaction, and in a very, very real way is a very good thing to be happening. And I think this is quite an important one to take in. It's of course not good in the sense that there's a lot of strain there and pressure, and that can lead to problems in the discs and the nerves, and like any strain and pressure. But in terms of that actual moment, you would be in bigger trouble if you reached out that way and your head didn't pull back, because you'd be falling on your nose and banging your head into the ground. So what's happening, once we can interpret it accurately, once we can have a reliable sensory appreciation, as Alexander put it, of that experience, is to realize, oh, that's my wonderful system protecting me. That's not the problem. The tension, the pulling back of the head, the tightening in my toes, etc., is not the problem. The problem is what this is an experience of. And of course, once I understand what those experiences are showing me, that I'm reached way forward out of my balance, then I'll know, in fact, I can say, oh, thank you, system, for protecting me and showing me that this is full of strain, so that I know what I'm doing, because I didn't realize what I was doing before I felt that. But now that I know that, and of course, especially as I know how I can move differently, I could do that reaching out in such a way as to stay centered, let that compensation happen as my arm goes out, my bottom and the rest of me goes back enough, and then I find there is no tightening through me. My toes aren't tense, my head isn't pulling back. None of that has to happen, because there are no imbalances anymore, and the system doesn't need to do any protective grabbing and tightening.
Mm-hmm. So basically, you're taking advantage of the fact that we're kind of wired to protect ourselves at some cost from a dangerous situation, and becoming, in this case, falling over, and that once we start to notice how we protect ourselves, we can use that as a way of figuring out a better way to do the action we're interested in doing. In this last case, reaching out.
Yes. In fact, it's doing this great human ability we have to play and explore, to go, how do we work? And as we're playing and exploring, you see we're going about things in ways that excite these various reactions and reflexes enough to go, oh, that's what happens.
Mm-hmm.
When I do it, that happens. And if I can also do this human thing of inhibiting that or turning off that head pulling back, it shows me how out of balance I really am. But I might not have known that before.
Right.
But as I play around with these things and uncover these principles and what they feel like, I'm literally understanding how I work and getting in touch with it. And then it's simply a question of being able to use that ongoing richness of experience to guide myself in what I do during the day. And again, I think it's very important to stress it isn't about right and wrong and practicing always being in support, because it doesn't matter. If you go out of support, you'll simply know it. So you can even be that free to be out of support, because you won't stay out of support, you won't hurt yourself, because as time goes on, of course, you get not only more and more aware of how things work well, and you tend to rather automatically work better, because the system is a self-refining system once it's, once we're aware of things. But also, should we go into some imbalance or some strain or something, you get better and better at picking it up very quickly, understanding what it's showing you, so you have a reliable appreciation of that sensory experience, namely, I'm way out forward here, and consequently you can adjust and change to a better way of functioning for the moment. So it's about constant information and response, and literally an ongoing guidance system that will simply refine itself and get better and better, and more subtle, but not subtle in the sense of no longer noticing, but subtle in the sense of more refined and less exaggerated. And consequently, of course, the forces are less, we have more freedom, and we're developing new neural coordinations, as well as a certain degree of more kind of presentness and awareness all the way through us. But this might be a good point to stop for this
Sure.
podcast
And I would just pick up on one thing you said, that the system can refine itself. But I think, as you also said, the requirement for that to happen is that we develop an awareness of what we're up to. And I think what happens with a lot of people, certainly people I see as students, is that their system has gotten out of balance. They're aware perhaps of the problems that's caused them, but for the most part, they're not aware of how they've put themselves out of balance. And so it seems to me that what you're suggesting is, say, unlike an automobile where, the engine doesn't have to know a whole lot about what's going on elsewhere in the car. It just does its thing. But with us, we in order to improve things, we have to develop an awareness of ourselves. And that's what I assume that in this podcast and the one just before, that's kind of what you're after. You're after people starting to notice things that they probably didn't notice before, that are not terribly difficult to notice, but just require a little thought, giving a little thought to it, and doing the kind of experiments, and as you say, playing with it.
Yes. In fact, you can see, and especially this comes out as people begin to give their feedback as we're playing around with these things. But one of the biggest reasons, too, why we can get kind of unaware and getting into these poor use things full of strain and tension and tighten and distortion is because people misinterpret what they're feeling. Mm-hmm. They tend to think, let's say with the reaching out one, they tend to think, oh, there's a bit of effort here. It's a bit hard. I'm not as flexible as I could be or as strong as I could be, or they go to bend towards the ground and stand up. And we'll see this particularly if we get to a podcast about sitting and standing, and people think, oh, that's because I have weight and there's gravity and I have to use these muscles to push myself up. And so they're feeling the strain and the effort and the tightening, but quite unaware that it's the way they're going about it that's causing that. It has nothing to do with weight or gravity. I mean, as we all know as teachers, of course, because it doesn't take very much to get somebody bending or sitting and standing in a way where there is no effort whatsoever and no sense of weight. And of course, they didn't lose weight. Gravity didn't change. They've just stopped going about it in a way that forces their system to tighten up and strain because of the pure mechanics of it. Mm-hmm. And so as people, they're not only, that's the understanding part of it, being able to be clear what it is I'm feeling when I'm feeling these strains and tightenings. And it's in large part a lot of these out of balance things, not some mysterious chronic unconscious habit that I now need to learn how to release. Once I can use myself centeredly in space, most of those things don't even happen anymore. They just dropped away automatically. But the other side of what you're saying is equally true. As people play around with it more, of course, we are going through things which do give you lots of feelings and hopefully the understanding of those feelings, so people do get more in touch. As they get more in touch, they tend to be noticing more of these things in the present moment instead of being ahead of themselves and way off and being busy. And so they're able to feel what's happening, and as they begin to understand what's happening, they're able to adjust themselves to be more free and open, and as they're free and open, they get more experiences because they're not as locked up, and so they're more present, and it becomes a real constructive circle that helps us get better and better at it, instead of the other way around where we get more and more out of touch and more misunderstanding. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't take very long. I usually find out of a weekend of playing with this, or a series of lessons, kind of, which is more what we're doing now, split up over a bit of time, that people can hugely change in, just a few days of playing with this, and drop away probably the bigger 80% or more of the forces operating on them as they go about in their daily life.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, let's end this podcast, and we will do some more in the series. My guest today has been David Gorman, an Alexander Technique teacher and developer of Learning Methods, who lives in Toronto, Canada, and who does workshops around the world in this method. David, thanks again for being on the show today.
Thanks, Robert. I just want to say one last thing. If any of you who have listened to this or played around with it, I'd be very, very interested in hearing some of your feedback about what you discovered, or especially in what you play with or discover in other moments of your life as you take it out and find out what you're doing. You can email me at david@learningmethods.com if you feel like it.
Okay, or you could just go to his website and find his email address there. The website address will be next to the interview. Okay, thanks a lot, David.
Thanks, Robert. Bye.